As passionate as the Kingdom Hearts community is, there are plenty of things that can still easily be overlooked or things that are just straight up not explored. This can go for story features like secret reports, little lore details, facial expressions, or on a completely other spectrum like gameplay mechanics. While a small group or few may notice some of these amazing features, for a wide majority, these things can go unnoticed or just straight up are not known, especially when it comes to how to use some of these things to your advantage in a game. A lot of people tend to find an option they are pretty comfortable with or an option they feel like is relatively good and tend to stick with that option, which is perfectly fine. But spending time with some things that you aren't as familiar with, some things that you would normally not go towards, things that are out of your comfort zone, can open up games and gameplay systems massively. Today I'm here joined by my friend the Frozen Cavern to discuss some amazing mechanics you can utilize in Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, or just some things you might not know about in general, mostly on the gameplay side. In this video, we both discuss mechanics that are rarely known about, and we also go into detail about how to use some mechanics that are more known, but people just don't tend to experiment with them. But trust me, once you guys find out about some of these things, it might change the way you play this game forever. At least for a couple of you. Well, let's not waste time and get right into it. Air cancelling is something you might have noticed happen a couple of times randomly in a mob fight, or perhaps you have watched some Birth by Sleep speedruns and have seen it used as a movement option. The concept is surprisingly simple. Whenever you go into a D-Link, command style, use certain attacks and or magic commands, or even an item while airborne, you immediately plummet to the ground to do the animation. This can be useful against certain enemies or when you're in a bad situation while airborne, or just need to get to the ground quicker. The reason this happens is because certain animations can only be done while on the ground. So instead of waiting for your character to fall, the game just teleports you to the ground. It's kind of funny looking, but it's really cool when you utilize this to your advantage. Birth by Sleep isn't known for having the best of air movement in the Kingdom Hearts series, so a lot of people tend to feel a lot more comfortable when they're grounded, since they have more access to their commands and abilities that way. So utilizing this can make air to ground scenarios feel a lot more controllable for the player. And also, most people tend to have at least one of these options or resources available, so it's pretty handy. This tends to be really useful as a combo tool as well if you're into that sort of thing. Hashtag cage combo contest, check it out. There are some extra benefits to doing this with a D-Link or a command style transformation in a fight, since it slows down time for the enemies temporarily, so it leaves you often in a slight advanced state. You must think a little bit about when you're going to use this in the middle of a fight though, especially a boss, but once you get the feel of it and know exactly how much or fast your gauge is filling up, you can completely manipulate this to your advantage. So go ahead and try it out. I've personally tested this out on a couple of different bosses and fights, most notably the Terranort fight, which this was really useful to perform a certain combo, and I found it a lot of fun. Using this purposely to keep the combo going was extremely satisfying. And my friend the Frozen Cavern is also utilized this in some of his Birth by Sleep combos as well.
Status ailments in the Kingdom Hearts series in general are pretty underlooked, especially outside of the number titles. However, in the right situation, they can be some of the most useful commands in the game, especially with Birth by Sleep. A general rule for status ailments in at least most Kingdom Hearts games is that they don't stack, meaning an enemy can't be ignited and asleep at the same time, for example. However, they can be chained together one after the other, and they are useful for filling the command gauge just a little bit more or keeping the gauge from reducing over time. We'll go over each status ailment in order from what we feel are the worst to the best. Blackout causes any enemy that's hit in the range to not be able to see for a period of time. This is actually one of the least useful status ailment moves in the entire series. Blinding opponents seems good until you realize that enemies can still attempt to hit you. And with them attacking wherever randomly, it makes fighting them harder as you can't predict where they're gonna go. So getting caught in the in lag of a missed block can very easily happen in a group. Not to mention it's the only status ailment that doesn't affect a single boss in the game. The only use it has is for making Terra exclusive commands and being sold for some cheap money since Blackout levels up quickly, but even then it's not a lot of money. Slow causes enemies hit by it to move slower. This is useful for any pesky enemies that often move quickly out of your range or sometimes have really fast attacks. The problem is you have to get close to them, which some commands and movement do help with, but just like Blackout, accidentally frame trapping yourself by blocking is actually easier than blocking them normally because they go so slow. And this ailment is outshined by quite a few others. At least this one can be used on a boss. Confuse makes any enemy hit within its range fight alongside you. This also sounds very useful, but the problem is enemies tend to stand around for a bit before doing anything, and given that they can only be confused for 6 to 8 seconds before needing another confusion hit, you won't get too much off of it, if anything at all. It at least gets enemies off your back without the fear of a stray confused enemy attacking you, but other commands do this job better. Stun causes enemies to not be able to attack momentarily. This is great and all, but it's only tied to certain commands, and it's completely random when it happens, making it the most unreliable ailment in the game, and having this ailment happen back to back is almost impossible. You can only hit them once before they go back to the normal state, but comboing is possible, especially with other status ailments. It also tends to be the only ailment that works on late game bosses, aside from the final ones and post game bosses, though I'm pretty sure the chance of it happening is significantly less than earlier in the game. Bind sets up an area where any enemy that steps into it cannot move. This is great for setups and getting certain enemies off your back. This only affects grounded enemies and hardly any bosses. Enemies in the air are momentarily halted, but are able to move freely afterwards. It also doesn't go very far off the ground, so it's not too useful for enemies super high in the air. Sometimes enemies that float along the ground can be affected. It's actually super weird how they're determined as grounded, if I'm being honest. This also doesn't stop projectiles from being fired at you either, and enemies can still try to attack you physically, so you've got to be a little bit cautious of that. Mini makes any enemy around you tiny, allowing you to damage them just by walking into them. They also try to run away from you, meaning you can do whatever. The damage you get for running into them is a little inconsistent, unfortunately. Sometimes you'll do a lot of damage, sometimes you'll do a little, and sometimes stepping on enemies at all can be a little tougher than you'd expect. You also still do about the same amount of damage when attacking, whether an enemy is tiny or not for whatever reason. Both Ignite and Poison are extremely similar, so they share the same spot. Ignite sets a single enemy on fire, dealing damage over time. The damage is really good against a single target and can affect a solid amount of bosses. If you have to wait out an enemy attack, this is a great thing to use. Poison is essentially Ignite, but is instead an area of effect move that does less damage, making it more useful for mob fights, though it does affect just as many if not more bosses. They're pretty interchangeable really. Freeze is essentially the same as Stun and Bind. However, unlike Stun, it's consistent in actually occurring, and unlike Bind, it affects airborne enemies by dropping them to the ground. Even unlike Mini, it's consistent in the damage you can get out of it. All of this has the additional fact of being able to affect multiple enemies easily. It does have the one hit before going into normal state thing, but the damage of that first hit is increased by triple the normal amount. This ailment isn't too beneficial against bosses though, and freeze attacks are only on grounded moves, so enemies can't be too high up or else it won't do anything. It doesn't affect too many bosses, and those that it does affect will usually break out of it before you can act on it, unless you do something immediately afterwards or already have something set up. But outside of that, it's basically the best of three worlds. Zero gravity sends enemies into the air, dealing a little bit of damage over time. Hitting an enemy while they're floating causes them to be confused after they get out of the anti-gravity. The fact that this automatically has another status ailment when it ends is stupidly good. It's already great for immobilizing a crowd while still dealing damage over time, but being able to have allied enemies after hitting them is insane. This can make a few air enemies harder to hit unfortunately, as it'll only send them higher up, and it's pretty rare to affect bosses, but aside from that, this is pretty much perfect. Sleep is somewhat similar to Stun where it causes enemies to be immobile. However, unlike both Stun and Freeze, you can hit an enemy multiple times. And honestly, you'll be surprised what does and doesn't wake up enemies. Basically, anything that doesn't count as a strong hit or inflict a status ailment won't wake them up early. For example, tier 1 magic spells that don't pop up enemies won't wake them up. For example, Fire won't wake up a sleeping enemy, but Fire and Fire Raga will. Some normal and command style attacks won't wake up enemies either, which is why combo pluses are very beneficial with sleep. An example of this is that Diamond Dust wakes up an enemy on the first hit up close, but if you're attacking from a distance, the first attack will not wake them up. On top of that, it also works on some bosses. If you know what you're doing, sleep can be a very powerful and interesting move. Stop is pretty much sleep, but enemies take the recoil of attacks after the spell has worn off, and doesn't have the waking up issue outside of other status ailments. However, putting on another status ailment will cause all store damage to happen immediately as a single hit, and therefore cause one hit stagger. If you are able to get multiple hits off, it's almost like you can inflict a stop after the fact to still be able to do something else. Almost as if you're moving twice in a turn-based game, if that makes any sense. This is only effective on 2 bosses though, but outside of that, this is still really good. Magnet is a little weird to call as a status ailment, but it does pretty much everything and more. It creates a barrier where any enemy around you is pulled in, rendered immobile, set up for easy punishment, and does slight damage over time. It's great against super high enemies, mob fights, and gives yourself time for offensive or defensive options. The only issue with this is that it affects almost no bosses, but it does affect Vanitas in 2 boss fights and it heavily hinders them, so that's all that matters. Other than that, this is the best status ailment in the whole game.
D-Links are a mechanic that aren't widely used in Birth by Sleep among more casual players, though it's a mechanic that changes the early game for Birth by Sleep and can also make late game extremely fun and interesting. I'm not going to say D-Links are the most unknown of mechanics or anything, it's definitely pretty known and people do use it, but I definitely don't feel like D-Links are utilized as often as say other mechanics in Birth by Sleep, which I think is unfortunate because D-Links are incredibly cool and is probably one of the coolest things about the game. I've went on before about how I love D-Links in this game, and it's a mechanic that I've just fallen in love with like over the past couple of years playing through Birth by Sleep over and over and over. Though now I want to talk about how you can actually use them to your advantage in this game, both the obvious stuff and stuff they don't tell you. So I have to go over how they work, of course. D-Links in this game are the ability to summon other characters' powers and use it for yourself. Throughout the game, you gain various D-Links depending on the character you are playing and the world you visit. D-Links give you a set list of commands that can change depending on how much you have your D-Link leveled up, which you can do by defeating enemies and collecting these glowing little wayfinders, which is unfortunately RNG. But grind enough and you'll eventually level them up. It's not too hard. Different D-Links come with different abilities as well. For example, Ventus has haste, which increases attack speed tremendously, which can turn Terra from this to this. You also have D-Links like Cinderella, which when leveled up can give you some regeneration for your health. Snow White, who increases command reload speed, which is incredibly useful. Mickey, giving you double XP and a auto teleport, which looks pretty cool in battle. And on top of this, each D-Link comes with a finisher that tends to be extremely useful if you get it, usually. Think of D-Links as a extra command deck you just switch to rather than equipping. Don't want to equip Sleep in your command deck? Switch to Maleficent. Need to heal and don't have a cure or potion in your deck? Switch to Aqua. You can easily revert back to your regular deck immediately after using what you need as well. Other notes about D-Links is that it cancels out all command styles if you're currently in one that you don't like, or just want to have your normal combos back. On top of being able to use this for air canceling, this makes your combat a lot more versatile when you're playing the game and can spice in fights up and give you access to things you normally would have to hop out of the fight and go into a menu for. And we all know Birth by Sleep unfortunately doesn't have a prepare and retry button, so that factor makes this even more useful.
Command level is something that the game talks about briefly, with a command being able to be melded at a certain point, and that does hold true. However, based on the level, the command usually gets better. That sounds very obvious, but there are multiple ways this applies. One benefit is that commands at higher levels sell for much more than those same commands at lower levels, which can be very useful to get some extra money for other commands, since getting money is actually pretty rough in this game. Also, any command that has an ability tied to it will give you that ability while equipped, but to have it permanently, the command must be leveled up all the way to the max. For combat purposes, one thing that is affected is shot locks. The level controls how fast the target rate is, which in turn affects how much of the focus gauge is used during a shot lock. Most shot locks also gain a second part to them at max shot lock count, once they reach a certain level. Certain magic and action commands are also more obvious with this too, like the mind spells getting more mines on the ground. Then there are the status ailments, which are a lot more subtle in their differences. Moves that inflict the status ailment seem to add about 2 extra seconds at max level compared to their base level. That may not be a lot of extra time, but multiple status ailments back to back can be very effective, especially those that do damage over time. The only unfortunate thing though is that the difference in strength of the commands are pretty much insignificant. I suppose that makes sense though, as that's mainly what abilities like Fire and Blizzard boost are for, which increases the damage, and having those both stack would be insane. Ice creams are an item that, despite how useful they can be, is very often overlooked. This is probably due to being in Disney Town and the minigames associated with that world aren't exactly looked at fondly. However, getting these ice creams can be very well worthwhile, and personally, I feel even Kingdom Hearts 3 could benefit from an item like this, which given Remy would have been entirely possible, but I digress. The ice creams are items that can be used up to 3 times per battle that allows you to go into a particular command style depending on the ice cream used, including second stage command styles. For the sake of simplicity, I'll explain what style stages are. Normally, most command styles can only be accessed in one of 2 stages, the first or the second. For example, Fire, Storm, and Diamond Dust are only accessible in the first stage when filling the command gauge with certain moves that meet its respective requirements. And similarly, Sky Climber and Ghost Drive are only accessible in the second stage, when you meet the requirements for it while in a first stage style. There are certain instances where these rules don't apply, like the Terra vs Ericus fight where Terra starts out in Dark Pulse, a second stage style, due to story reasons, as well as a certain command style I'll mention later. Ice creams allow you to completely bypass these rules in normal gameplay, meaning you can use any style in any stage without having to meet any normal requirements. Since these are items, they are also useful for air cancelling mentioned earlier. Ice creams do have their own rules though. 1. In order to use an ice cream and get a command style, you have to unlock that command style first. Otherwise, it will fill the gauge and either give you your current finisher or a command style based on what requirements you met when using it, which even then can still have its own use. 2. No matter how many times you use different types of ice creams, you can only go up to 2 styles. Using an ice cream at this point, regardless of the type, will automatically give you the current style's finisher. 3. Using ice cream for a form you are already in will give you its finisher. However, if you've already used an ice cream to activate a second stage command style in the first stage and meet the requirements for the same style, you'll activate the command style again. 4. If in the first stage you get to the style's finisher, using another ice cream won't do anything but refill the gauge. Now, before you can do any of this, you have to get the ingredients, which I feel is another reason these items aren't looked at very often. I believe there's a misconception with these. Since you have to go out of your way to get these ingredients, the ingredients either take forever or are hard to make, similar to the synthesis items in other games, right? Not at all. You can just look up where to find the ingredients since it's not 2010 anymore, and at that point, making the ice creams is just a matter of minutes. At most, it'll take slightly over half an hour to make all of the ice creams, and after making them for the first time, you don't even need to get more ingredients as you can buy them with money. These are honestly the easiest and most grind-friendly synthesis type item in the entire series. There's also a certain command style I mentioned before that I didn't go into, Frozen Fortune, a Blizzard-based style. To get this, you have to clear Desert Paradise on Mastered mode with a fantastic rating in the ice cream music minigame in Disney Town. Once you've done that, this style activates randomly whenever you use an ice cream, whether in the first or second stage. I tend to avoid this though because of the fact that it's random, so yeah, don't do that minigame requirement, but I have a feeling most people won't anyways.
When I was younger, playing Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep at the time, I never sat down and thought to myself about what my experience would be like with this game years from now. Most people don't do that with single player games anyways, so it's not that unusual. Though this game had always had a sweet spot in my heart because it was one of the Kingdom Hearts games that had the biggest impact on me. I've replayed this game over the past decade countless times, but admittedly, most times I replayed the game, I was playing it the exact same way I was when I was 12, maybe being a lot better, being faster, a lot sharper and more precise, with my Thunder Surge timing I guess, though I was playing the game the exact same way almost every time with extremely minor differences that often were by chance rather than on purpose. Though recently, I've been re-experiencing this game, and not just me, but Cavern as well, who you also heard throughout the video, along with many others who have revisited some of these games after Kingdom Hearts 3 or with the recent PC releases, while waiting for the next saga to begin. I barely acknowledged mechanics like D-Links a few years ago, but now when I play the game, it's something constantly on my mind. I always dodge spam Vanitas into a Thunder Surge attack, but now I'm trying to do silly sleep loops into command finishers on him. I've actually found a lot of enjoyment with the fight because of that. Not all games are timeless, but your experience can lengthen your enjoyment for sure. Though sometimes your experience with the game is a lot more up to you than you may think. Going a little off route towards that chest you always walk past could just change everything for you. It kind of did for me. I have newfound love for Birth by Sleep, and I've always loved this game, but this is definitely different and in a very good way. We plan on doing more videos like this for hopefully as many Kingdom Hearts games as we can, especially for the more unexplored or unknown ones. The experiences we've been having recently have been too fun not to share. Hopefully you can share some of yours with us. Though that will be all for today. That will be all from us. Make sure you subscribe to the Frozen Cavern link down below because they were a big part in putting this video together. However, on my end, if you enjoyed, you already know what to do. Leave a like, share the video with a friend or a family member, and last but not least, you have not already, and want to become a part of the union, all you have to do is hit that red little subscribe button down below. My name is Prodigy, and I will talk to you guys soon. Peace out, you guys. Bye.
Now she's a daydreamer. She's always thinking about him. No more room in this picture for you to fit in. Now she's crying on the phone, telling you she's not good enough for him. When you think that she is perfect.